The following is a presentation from the Greece Historical Society. The second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society are sponsored by members of the Greece Historical Society and by the sponsors of advertisements in the newsletter. Space for today's program is sponsored by the Greece Central School District's Transportation and Support Services Facility. Elsa Von Blumen, Rochester's first female cyclist, presented by
Karen Lankeshofer, and
recorded Tuesday, November 12th, 2024.
Well, welcome everyone. We got a reasonable good crowd tonight. Karen Lankeshofer, and excuse me if I didn't do it right.
That was perfect.
Is a longtime Henrietta resident who has also taught in Germany and Russia. She's an avid bike rider and advocates for safe cycling infrastructure. She enjoys studying history, especially that concerns upstate New York. She discovered Elsa Von Blumen several years ago and has been researching her intensively. Her presentation is a tribute to this pioneering female professional athlete whose story deserves to be better known. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much. Do I need a microphone, or am I good?
It's better for the recording too.
Oh, sorry, okay. I'm going to use a microphone. Thank you, Bill, very much, and I thank the Greece Historical Society for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm going to tell you about one of my newest heroes, Elsa Von Blumen. She's a Rochesterian. Her birth name was Caroline Kiner. And after she married, she was Caroline Kiner Roosevelt. And her professional name was Elsa Von Blumen. She was a race walker before she became a bicyclist in the 1880s. And at that time, there were few other professional women in sports. And I really want people to know her story because she dominated a decade of bicycle history, of sport history. And I just think it's a shame that we Rochesterians don't know more about her. So I'm doing my part to spread the word. Elmina Kiner in Kansas in October 6, 1859. Her parents were both German immigrants. Her father, Georg Friedrich Kiner, served in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed out in Kansas that year. Her mother was Johanna Sophia, or called Anna, Goetze. The family moved around quite a bit when she was young. One of her siblings was born in Maryland, one in Michigan, another in Florida. So Carrie sometimes mistakenly gave her own birthplace as Florida. Frank, the only boy in the family, was born in Oswego in 1870. And this was actually a difficult time for the family. Her father died and she was shipped off at one point to live as a boarder in Sterling, which isn't far from Oswego. And of course, living as a boarder meant you were going to help in the household. She had no formal education. And within a 5-year span, her father, maternal grandmother, and aunt died, and her mother moved the family to Rochester. And Carrie followed the family to Rochester sometime in late 1877 or early 1878. Some 2.5 years ago, there lived in Oswego, New York, a German widow with a number of small children. Among these was a young girl so delicate in health that physicians told her that unless she left the neighborhood of Oswego and sought a drier atmosphere, she could not live long. Accordingly, the mother, though in very humble circumstances, took her family to Rochester in the hope that the climate there would be more favorable. The hope, however, proved delusive, and the daughter's health failed so rapidly that in the autumn of 1878, her doctor told her that she could not live till spring. In this extremity, he advised that she daily walk as far as her strength would permit, telling her that the faint hope extended by this treatment was all that he could offer. His advice was taken, and the young lady found the course prescribed highly beneficial. So she obviously wasn't a healthy child. She gave an interview to a journalist in March of 1887, and he reported the following conversation. The cold winter incident to all cities upon the Great Chain of Lakes proved too severe for her delicate frame. She rapidly declined and was pronounced by several physicians to be in the first stages of consumption, which is, of course, tuberculosis. By the advice of friends, she undertook a course of physical exercise, often walking 5 or 6 miles a day, together with light exercise with dumbbells and clubs. The beneficial results were soon manifest. She became possessed of an extraordinary powers of endurance and showed herself capable of undergoing prolonged exertion without injury. So while she started walking in Oswego, when she got to Rochester, she continued and practiced in Philip Schaad's dance hall on South Avenue. And if you're familiar with the South Wedge, we have South Avenue here. The street up there is Sanford Street. Down here we see Caroline Street. And right on the corner of Sanford and South Ave was Philip Schaad's Dance Hall. And if you drive down there today, you're going to see Vale's Automotive on that exact spot. So, enter Bert Miller into the picture. Bert was born William H. Roosevelt, which was also occasionally spelled with one O, in 1842 in Richmond, Massachusetts. He served in the Civil War, and there's no record as to why he took the alias of Bert Miller. But it wasn't uncommon for Civil War soldiers who might have enlisted under false names, or they were hiding their age. But he may have also taken it later for professional purposes when he became a manager and agent. And in 1870, he was listing himself as a traveling agent and commercial traveler. In reality, he was nothing more than a snake oil salesman and a huckster. In the early 1870s, he lived in Utica with his first wife, and by 1876, he was living at 7 Caroline Street in Rochester, right around the corner from Philip Schaad's Dance Hall. And that's this property right here, and you can see the proximity. I'm guessing this is where he and Carrie first encountered each other. He purported to have been the manager of famed professional walker Edward Peyton Weston. This was definitely not true. Weston walked through Rochester one time from Boston to Chicago, and all of a sudden Bert's his manager? I don't think so. He was, however, managing Bertha von Berg, a young female professional walker at the time he met Carrie. And I'm guessing that when he started managing Carrie, he suggested she adopt a professional name. They reached back to her German roots and came up with Elsa Von Blumen. So in order to understand Elsa's success, we have to understand Bert. The Troy Standard devotes over a column to exhibiting Bert Miller, or William E. Roosevelt, the manager of Elsa Von Blumen, whose right name is Lena Kleiner, in his true light. Bert got drunk in Albany and beat his wife, and while in Troy became balmy and choked his wife until she was a trifle darker in the face than usual. He abused Elsa Von Blumen in a shameless manner and called her all the vile names he could recollect. All Elsa receives is $25 for each 100 miles, even the benefits going into Miller's bag. Elsa has been put away in cheap rooms while Miller, his wife, and the other leeches have rolled in luxury. At Waterford, Miller compelled Elsa, after she had walked 100 miles, to get in an open carryall and ride to Troy, and the natural consequence was the simple young girl was taken by a cold which will doubtless take her to her grave. As soon as Elsa completes her task at Ithaca, she will leave Miller and return to her home in Rochester. The sum total the girl has received will not exceed $150. while Miller has thousands as a result of his thievery. We are satisfied from the company Miller kept while here that he was a bad man. You have to understand, this guy was rotten. But without Bert, there would have been no Elsa, and without Elsa, there would have been no successful Bert. And I have to say, in other newspaper accounts, he was often praised for his managerial skills. But there were also reports of him physically fighting with other managers, arguing with newspaper editors, and cheating Elsa and her opponents out of their money. He was also suspected of incorrectly measuring the tracks Elsa walked or rode on to make it look as if she had completed more miles than she actually did. And these were known among the colleagues and racers of the time as Miller miles. And Bert sometimes refused to defend Elsa. After one race in 1886, she was furious that she'd been cheated out of 10 miles by dishonest scorekeeping. Bert refused to intervene on her behalf, so she herself went to the press and made it publicly known. And my suspicion is Bert had put his money on the other guy. And to top it off, who was doing the scorekeeping? Bert's brother-in-law. So he was in it for as much money as he could make. So the first sport she practiced was pedestrianism. And that is her in her walking costume. And you notice she has a whip in her hand. That whip was presented to her by Governor Lucius Robinson back at that time. So pedestrianism was a 19th century form of competitive walking, often professional and funded by wagering, from which the modern sport of race walking developed. Pedestrianism became a fixture at fairs, much like horse racing, developing from wagers on foot races. Always the wagering, always the money. So there were two ways it could be carried out, and the competitors decided that before the race. One was called heel and toe, where one part of the foot must always be on the ground, and that's even practiced today in the modern Olympics. And the other one was just called go as you please, anything short of running. So, and this was the world Carrie chose to enter. Even if Bert skimmed much of Elsa's prize money and gave receipts off the top, Elsa was still going to earn more as a pedestrian than she would have in conventional women's employment at the time. And she had been working as a seamstress. You have to keep in mind her widowed mother was very poor and supported at least 4 other children at home. And Carrie was helping her out, of course. And she never would have been able to secure professional athletic engagements without the patronage of a man. And I have to say, I think she also really enjoyed the adventure and notoriety of being a female athlete. Elsa's first appearances were in Rochester and the surrounding area, and one of her first races was in the State Armory in Oswego, New York, in January of 1879, where she would attempt to walk 100 miles in 27 hours without sleeping. So we're talking about extreme sport, even back then. In 1880, she'd already expanded her performance venues to many towns in Ohio and West Virginia. Some of her races were outside on sawdust or gravel tracks, and some were inside in opera houses or armories. And sawdust tracks were also laid down inside the buildings just to soften the footsteps of the walkers. There was always musical accompaniment, and spectators, often numbered in the thousands, to watch someone walk. Thousands. President Chester A. Arthur was a tremendous fan of pedestrianism. And so the funny thing was, with all these spectators, it wasn't uncommon for them to walk back and forth across the track while the people were performing, because they were allowed to sit inside the oval of the track as well as in the bleachers outside, and they just came and went as they pleased. Yeah. 6, 7, yeah. So she received much praise wherever she performed. The neighboring press speaks of her in the very highest terms, and we are satisfied that the entertainment will be in every respect worthy of patronage. And the best people of the city need have no hesitancy in attending. There will be nothing in the exhibition to offend the most fastidious lady, and thousands of ladies have witnessed Miss Von Blumen's walking in other places. So keep in mind, organized sport as entertainment for others first started emerging after the Civil War. And at that time, polo and tennis, along with bicycle riding, were sports of the elite class. High wheel bikes were only being ridden, and I say only in parentheses, but it was the majority of white, rich young men, because they were expensive play toys. Sports such as boxing, walking, or bicycle racing at county fairs against horses were for the working classes. But if Elsa wanted to earn money, she had to appeal to the upper social classes because that's where the money was. Miss Elsa Von Blumen has just completed an engagement in this city. Nothing occurred during the entertainment to offend in the least the most refined. It was heartily enjoyed and largely patronized by the best circles of society, including the clergy. So she and Bert relied heavily on advanced PR blitzes and promoting goodwill among the hosting town's elite, obviously. He scouted out reputable groups such as bicycle clubs, fire companies, or local bands to sponsor the events. And she received praise almost everywhere she went. She knew how to play the audience and flirt with the journalists who were sent to interview her, who were all male, of course, at that time. And she would send out these private invitations to her races to the town elite, and then she would tell the local press that the printing shop she had used in town was the best she'd ever seen. So she really learned how to be very PR savvy and butter up the right people. So this was the show bill from her walk in Oswego. Notice she's the unrivaled lady pedestrian. And she found a guinea pig to race against her. H.B. Carter was willing to walk against her. Sometimes races were for distance. Sometimes races were for time. How much could you walk in one time? It varied every time, depending on her opponent. One important thing to notice, down at the bottom you see Bert Miller is her manager, assistant manager, A.F. Everett, Bert's brother-in-law, the one who cheated her out of the 10 miles. He was supporting his whole family on her back. It was really an abusive relationship. So in order to draw the right crowds to bring in the most money, her costumes had to be decent and demure to appeal to the upper classes. She had to maintain decorum, and her comportment had to be impeccable. The first article describes her walking costume, the second her bicycle costume. Her walking costume is neat and appropriate. The skirt is of cardinal red silk trimmed with blue satin, reaching almost to the tops of her shoes, which are of regular pedestrian pattern. And all that meant was an everyday normal shoe. She didn't wear Nikes, nothing like that. Just what she had in her closet. And one thing I did learn, she had a costume that was lovely emerald green. And every time she put it on, she started getting sick. It turned out that the dye used was arsenic-based, and she was getting arsenic poisoning. So to her bicycle costume, her costume is as modest as her face, being a sort of bloomer affair of a subdued lead color supplemented by light leggings reaching from the knee down. The costume and her head surmounted by a jockey cap. Her appearance on the bicycle is that of the greatest ease, and while she circles the hall rapidly, it seems to require no exertion whatever on her part. It is indeed almost the poetry of motion. And there we see her jockey hat surmounted upon her head. She also claimed that she refused to allow gambling at her races. Now, these races could not have existed without the side bets. And was she so naive to think that it wasn't happening? I doubt it. She got savvy pretty quickly. She really learned what was going on. But she had to present this image of propriety and purity, and I'm the sweet little woman, because remember, she's one of a few women in a man's world now. So she had to maintain this image, and so she always denied she knew any gambling was going on. But her life was not without controversy, as you might imagine. These incidences occurred in Weedsport in 1883 and paralleled a very, very turbulent time in her private life. The crowd was sorely disappointed and disgusted with the exhibition, which was certainly well advertised. Among the incidents of the day, the Sentinel says that one boy was run over. A woman had several ribs broken, her knee dislocated, and was otherwise seriously injured. Drunken people lay along the streets and in doorways. 2 fights occurred, one a regular prize fight. 2 women had a fight with fists and parasols on the road to the fairground. To gull the people, it was represented that Miss Von Blumen was a member of a church and that her escort is a clergyman. Weedsport don't want any more of Elsa Von Blumen. And further, in that interview to the Oswego Times, Mr. Miller said that his wife and little daughter accompanied them on their travels and led the reporter to believe that she was there with them. Perhaps this was unintentional, wink, wink. But as it turns out, Mrs. Miller was not with them. This morning, the lady who had arrived in the city sent the reporter her interview, the little bicyclist, and told her story, and we give her statement. She says frankly that herself and Elsa do not get along together. For some reason, Elsa does not like to have Mrs. Miller with her, and the latter lady, who appears to be passionately attached to her husband, decidedly objects. So the first slide seems to be a little exaggerated and overblown. In every newspaper article, you find the story always a little different. It's not much different than today, depending on the reporter. But I'm not really sure how Elsa could have been held responsible for 2 women fighting with fists and parasols. But the meaning of the article is clear. Elsa is apparently not the upstanding citizen she purported to be, and she drew the wrong kind of people with whom the upper classes should not choose to associate. And from other newspaper reports, I discovered it's highly likely that Elsa's problems in Weedsport were partially caused by Bert's wife spreading gossip about her there. Because there was certainly no love lost between the 2 women. And to add to that, Bert tried to cheat the Sentinel out of payment for the show bills. So the Sentinel newspaper, to get even, ran this nasty report. So what do you do? So she practiced pedestrianism from late 1878 until 1880, and then in 1880 she switched from walking to bike riding. Miss Von Blumen is 23 years old, weighs 120 pounds, and rides a 52-inch Royal Mail weighing 21 pounds. In one article, they even gave her bust measurement. Mr. Pope of the Bicycle Manufacturing Company encouraged me to learn to ride, she said yesterday. He promised me the best machine he could make if I learned to ride, so I did. So who's Mr. Pope and what does he have to do with bicycles and Elsa? Albert Augustus Pope was born in 1843 in Boston, Massachusetts. He served in the Civil War as a captain, but later received the honorary title of Lieutenant Colonel and was thereafter always known as Colonel Pope. He used $900 of his savings to invest in a shoemaker supplies factory, which prospered and he became a very successful industrialist. Then in 1876, he attended the Philadelphia exhibition and saw the penny farthing bikes there, and he just fell in love with them. The penny farthing, one great big wheel in the front, and the little wheel in the back. He started importing them and selling them, and later united with the Weed Sewing Machine Company in Hartford, Connecticut, and started manufacturing his own bikes. And this brand was called Columbia. And they manufactured for a long time. The name's familiar to some of you, I see, yeah? It's possible that Pope observed Elsa at a walking race and recognized her talent and the potential for publicity for his bicycle manufacturing company. And I also found an article from 1884 in which Elsa said that she had seen an ad offering a handsome bike to the lady who would learn to ride it, which is also a possibility, because she was a gutsy woman, and I can imagine Bert pushing her to try it, anything to get more publicity and bring in more spectators. So how she really got into cycling is uncertain, but it's interesting that if you look at the old bicycle advertisements from back then, they often had lovely ladies with gossamer gowns on these bicycles, although women were discouraged from riding by the clergy, by doctors, and by the upper classes. It just wasn't ladylike, it wasn't healthy, and it was a sin. And as always, however, sex sells, and getting an attractive young female to use one of Colonel Pope's bikes would certainly increase attention to his product. So in order to understand what an incredible feat it was for her to ride this bike, I'm going to just explain a little bit about how bicycles developed. So interestingly enough, the first ancestor of the bicycle, the Dry-Z, its development might have been accelerated by a volcanic eruption in Indonesia in 1815. There was so much ash and pollution, the skies over Europe darkened in 1816, causing crops to fail and the farm animals, including horses, which were a means of transportation, then to die. So along comes Karl Freiherr von Drais, who was a minor German civil servant working in the forestry industry, and he was living in the southwestern part of Germany. And he was a tinkerer and an inventor, and he came up with that prototype of a bicycle, today's bicycle, called a Draisine after him. D-R-A-I-S was his last name. And it was propelled by straddling the saddle and scraping your feet along on the ground. And of course, this precluded women with their bulky clothing from using the machine. The next major development was the velocipede, and you notice there is a pedal now on the front axle. And this machine was about 1860, and it's credited to both Pierre Michaud and Pierre Lallemand in France. The next big invention came from James Starley in England in about 1870, and this was called the penny farthing, also the ordinary or the high wheel. Now, it's a little hard to see, and you'll see it better in other pictures, but on the back is a little bitty step, and you were asking how they even rode these things. So I'm going to put the mic down for just a minute. You grab the handlebar, you gain momentum, 1 foot on that little step, throw your leg up over the saddle, and remember, these pedals are constantly moving. There's no neutral. So she had to get her foot onto a moving pedal and ride away. I break my neck. So, why did they make a big wheel in the front? With the pedals still on the axle? One revolution of the pedal on a big wheel allows you to cover a lot more ground than on a smaller wheel. That was just simply physics.
How do you get off?
I'm sorry?
How do you get off?
Carefully. There were brakes on the machine, and I know in her races she had assistants who would come and hold the machine for her. Otherwise, you found a step or some big rock to get off on. I know when she was first practicing, the reports said that she would only take it out at night and practice on the streets because she didn't want people to see, how many times she fell. So it's not easy. So the last big development, about 1885, and the direct predecessor of what we know today as a bicycle, was called the Safety, and it was developed by John Kemp Starley. Notice now we've got the chain-driven back wheel. Our front wheel has the independent steering, and best of all, they started putting on pneumatic tubes to make the ride a little more comfortable. And when these safeties started being developed, this was in the late 1880s, 87, 88, 89 in the United States, that's when women really started getting into bicycling. And it's interesting, that's just about the time that Elsa was ending her career. And she said she didn't like the ordinaries, and late 1880s, she was already in her late 20s, almost 30 in 1889. So she never really got involved with the safety bikes. Now here, you can very clearly see her left foot on that step, which helped her propel herself into the saddle. So it's not as if she was a race walker one day and the next day she was a cyclist. Bicycle races were slowly transitioned into her walking exhibitions for the novelty and to bring in more spectators. As walking became of less interest as a sport, she concentrated then on the riding. She was a pioneer in the field, and she had little female competition, which is why she first raced against horses, then occasionally against men. One other woman racing in the early 1880s was a French-Canadian named Louise Armando. She and Elsa competed against each other in July of 1882 in Philadelphia, and Louise won. And Elsa did her best to avoid any head-on competition with her after that. She did not like losing. Toward the end of the decade, following Elsa and Louise's examples, then you saw an influx of many more female riders. So this is just a list of some of the bicycles she rode on. And you have to keep in mind, please, that bicycles were not cheap. And it would have been very difficult for a working class woman to afford one. It may truly be that Colonel Polk gave her her first bike as a gift for his own publicity purposes. There was also at least one incident in which her bike was confiscated for lack of payment of bills. And I have to say, as crooked and as unscrupulous as Bert was, I'm going to take his side in one disagreement. He and Elsa were traveling through Elmira, and they were at the train station, so Bert took her bike and parked it inside the ladies' waiting room. A constable came through, saw it there and said, "This doesn't belong here," took it and leaned it up against the outside of the building. And when Bert discovered that, he was livid. He ran to the police station and he complained, and they laughed him out of the building. But if you consider, this bike was, one, expensive, it was Elsa's livelihood, and Elsa was Bert's meal ticket. So, yeah, I'd be mad too. And this one, I think some of you may already know. Do you know where that is? Right around the corner from you.
Driving park.
Driving Park. This is a very famous illustration which appeared in Frank Leslie's Illustrated magazine. and it's a driving park in Rochester. Now just the name of a street, it was a well-visited racetrack at that time. Races were held there from 1874 to 1895. After Elsa learned to ride in late 1880, she first started giving bicycle riding demonstrations and lessons here in Rochester. But her first real race was against the trotter Hattie R., pictured there, in Driving Park on May 24th, 1881. It was best of 3 heats, and Hattie R. had to do 1.5 miles to Elsa's mile. In the first heat, the horse beat her by 1 second, and Elsa won the next 2 heats handily. And interestingly enough, at this time in Rochester, people were starting to collect money for the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which is down in Washington Square, right across from Jiva Theater. So, smart Bert Miller, manager, "Oh, Elsa, let's say we'll donate some of the purse to this monument fund if they will let you race there." Ta-da! That's how she got started. And in many cases, she would, once she rode to benefit the Irish Fund, she rode to benefit the base of the Statue of Liberty in 1884. She always found an excuse for them to offer her a race, as long as she gave them a little of the money, or she gave them a little of the money. So that was her first race. From there, she went to all over New York State, Geneva, Syracuse, Perry, Governor, and many other small towns in New York, where she performed against horses and sometimes men, usually at county fairs, but often in other venues such as music halls or convention halls. And it's important to remember, all her racing was done on tracks, even inside the buildings. They built the track to fit the building. And some of the tracks had banked curves at the end. So can you imagine being on a high wheel bike and leaning into a curve? No thank you. So of course they varied in size according to the building. And after racing locally, she started expanding her sphere to Ohio and Pennsylvania. Bert was usually in town ahead of her to look for opponents and venues and drum up publicity. The race which catapulted her into the limelight on the national scene was her race in Pittsburgh, in which she rode 1,000 miles in 6 days. So racing was forbidden on the Sabbath. So many of these these 6-day races often started Mondays at 1 a.m. Some people also later expressed doubt that she'd really ridden the 1,000 miles because Bert Miller's brother-in-law, Augustus Raverett, was doing the scorekeeping. But even if she only accomplished 900 miles, it would have been an amazing feat. The Bicycling World Journal of December 4th, 1881, right after the race, ran an interview with her in which she was asked, "You are not sorry it is so near over?" "No, indeed. There is a long day yet to come, and I wish it was ended. If I complete this task successfully, I do believe I will try again. I don't believe I will try again. It is useless for me to say I have not suffered, for there have been times I thought I must give up. Indeed, I declared several times I would quit, but somehow I worried through." And then later that month, the Ithaca Journal reported that immediately after the race, Bert was abusing her so badly that she tried to commit suicide by jumping out of her hotel window. And later, the local newspaper interviewed Elsa's mother and asked about the alleged incident. And Elsa's mother denied that she tried to commit suicide, but when asked if Bert had been abusing Elsa, the mother had absolutely no comment. So, I mean, she wasn't dumb either. She knew what was going on, but she was thankful to have that money coming in for the household. So as painful as that race was in Pittsburgh, she did try it again in Detroit. And she'd been to New Orleans first, to the Mardi Gras, then she comes up to Detroit, and she's going to do another 1,000 miles, she thinks. It was a total fiasco. To start off with, when they booked the music hall for that 6 days, it had already been booked for the first Monday evening, so on Monday, she could only ride 12 hours instead of the 16 she wanted to. So the entourage arrives in Detroit, and she's not feeling well. Turns out she had varioid fever, which is a form of smallpox. So she gets sent to the pest house, which is a form of a clinic. The doctor's treating her there, and he falls in love with her and proposes marriage. She refuses him. He confiscates her bike for payment. So the local newspaper intervenes on her behalf, and she got the bike back in time to start the race. Another person said to me, gosh, this sounds like a soap opera. But, so she got her bike back, and of course she's getting out of the pest house just before the race, so she's certainly not fully healthy. But she starts racing on April 10th, and by the 15th, the press reported she looked exhausted, but her pluck kept her going. So she reaches the 700-mile mark, someone steps on the track in front of her, causing her to fall off her bike, and directly into the steam heaters. They pick her up, carry her off the track. She got head injuries and bruises. 30 minutes later, she returns, gets on the bike, and rides some more. But she had to take frequent rests then. She was really hurting. And in the end, she only, that's in quotation marks, completed 850 miles. So the event turned out to be a big money loser, and to top it off, her treasurer absconded with $200 of her money. So her admirers sponsored some benefits for her where she raced against horses around Detroit. And that helped a little bit to recoup some of her losses. Then, in Philadelphia, in 1882, I mentioned she was already defeated by Louise. But in August of 1882, she teams up with Louise to race against Canadian champion W.J. Morgan at Coney Island. So she and Louise tag team every half hour, and Morgan has to complete the entire 6-day circuit on his own. And in the end, he beat them by just about 1.5 miles. Now later that week, Elsa and Louise did race against each other over 50 miles, and Louise beat Elsa by 12 miles. So that she never made too much public about. Then in 1883, as I said, that was her year, the bad press in lead sport, and a very turbulent time in her life, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And 1883 and 84 were mostly local, low-key affairs at fairgrounds against horses. Then in 1885, she goes to Buffalo over the Thanksgiving Day weekend, and she rode 400 miles in 51 hours. They laid down a track inside the Main Street rink in Buffalo, and that required her to do 9.31 laps to complete a mile. And in this case, they hired an engineer to measure the track because they wanted to make sure it wasn't Miller miles. And to complete the 400 miles, which she did with 10 minutes to spare, she had to go around the track 3,727 times. And this was exhausting, absolutely exhausting. So in 1886, she was in the Fitzhugh rink in Rochester against John Talmadge, and in Auburn against W.A. Hoagland, and Hoagland had to walk and she rode. She was supposed to cover twice as many miles as he did. And this was where she got cheated out of the 10 miles and was so furious. And that year she also went down to Macon, Georgia, and she raced Robert A. Brantley outside in the rain and lost. Then in 1888, we see more female riders emerging. Jessie Oakes had emigrated from England and settled in Rochester, where she saw Elsa ride. And she took up the sport and was soon challenging Elsa, whom she considered a role model. Jessie also ended up being managed for a time by Bert. So in 1888, there was a series of Jessie versus Elsa races throughout the United States, which they billed as the American champion against the British champion. And many people said, they would watch the races and say, this is hippodromed. And what they meant by that was the race was fixed. And then the last day of 1888, 5 women got on high wheel bikes and raced down in Pittsburgh. Then Elsa's last big race was a 6-day affair in Madison Square Garden in February of 1889, and this was the first ever bicycle race in Madison Square Garden. 14 females started and only 5 finished. Elsa finished second to Lottie Stanley, but only because a man came onto the track and stuck a cane into the spokes of her wheel, causing her to fall. So you have to think, many men were opposed to women's cycling in general and women's racing in particular. When she started, it was a novelty and everybody thought, oh, how cute, this adorable little woman is racing a bicycle. But you see more and more women getting into the sport and being good at it, and men felt their domain being threatened because it had been a primarily male sport, and opposition just grew. So the remainder of 1889, she was with a traveling troupe which included Josie Hawks as her racing competition. And Josie was a decent female bicyclist, but it was somebody Elsa could always beat. And the other entertainment included the Woody Quartet, a male vocal singing group, the Kemp Brothers, Roman Hippodrome Riders, balloon ascensions and parachute jumping, and Captain Bogardus and 3 sons rifle shooting. So it was basically a Buffalo Bill Cody traveling show type thing. The last performance I found for her was in August of 1890, and she was 30 years old at that time. What did she think about her profession? Elsa's quoted as saying, "I like this business, and although I say that every year will be my last, I still stick to it. I do a great deal of riding at country fairs, and sometimes the experience is anything but pleasant, for the tracks are usually horrible, and the country people seem to think I can ride over anything, or through mud and uphill without any difference. After my winter's rest, my muscles are soft, and it takes a good deal of riding to get me into condition." So, look at that lovely picture. This is the Carnegie Library in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, which is now incorporated into Pittsburgh, under construction in 1888. And look at the construction fence. It says 6 days female bicycle race. Von Blumen, Oaks. New Year's week, Grand Central Rink every afternoon and evening. So these events drew crowds. They were well advertised and well attended. So her career was extraordinary, of course, but this is just a list of some of the injuries she sustained. And so what made her want to continue in an occupation that was so strenuous and demanding? And I always like to use the word that the press often used for her, and that word is plucky. It's a word often used, it was a word often used at that time, and it embodies the sense of courage and adventure that one needs to do something out of the ordinary. And keep in mind, she was also helping support her mother, her widowed mother, and siblings with her earnings. And there were different methods employed to keep her in a race sometimes. Sometimes an assistant would run along beside her and hold her steady. The Daily Register of Wheeling, West Virginia wrote in February of 1880, Miss Von Blumen is given an occasional sip of fluid extract of cocoa. She uses no stimulants. The Bicycle World reported at her 1,000-mile race, during the last few hours of her ride, it was necessary to keep her up with stimulants applied outwardly. But there was no explanation of what these stimulants were. So in spite of the dangers that her profession presented, she was reported to have, the newspaper reported, Miss Von Blumen is fond of her profession and says it does not injure her health. I don't know, the other reports said otherwise, but she really did enjoy what she was doing. So now let's go back to 1883, when she had that very bad press in Weedsport. And I said this was also paralleling a terrible time in her private life. She married Emery E. Beardsley in January of that year, and it was really a whirlwind courtship. She'd gone to Oswego in December to visit friends, met Beardsley, and married him the next month. Unbeknownst to Elsa, the members of her husband's family had had many run-ins with the law. She later explained that she'd gone to Oswego to visit the friends in late 1882 and met Beardsley at that time. The Ogdensburg Journal of May 1887 reported that Miss Von Blumen has since alleged that the recollection of this marriage is very vague. The step was hasty, and she firmly believes that she was under some influence at the time. I also think, just personal opinion, it's possible she married Emery to spite Bert. Because I can imagine their relationship was more than just professional. I think she was in love with him, in spite of all the abuse. And if you recollect the jealousy of his wife, of Bert's wife, I think she suspected the same. So in March 1883, she leaves Hannibal. She's going to come back and visit her mom and her siblings. She returns to Hannibal, finds all her belongings missing from the house. She gets a search warrant. They go to Emery's parents' farm, and she finds many of her possessions, ones that hadn't been sold off already, hidden under the haystacks. So she has Beardsley and his parents arrested for larceny. They separate in March of 1883, and now she's no longer going to be a housewife. Her career is on again. But in 1885, Emery sues Elsa for divorce because it turns out that Bert and Elsa had been signing into hotels together as husband and wife, which was, of course, against the law at that time. Not to be defeated, Elsa paid him a visit, and he invited her in to stay the night. Whereupon the judge disallowed Beardsley's lawsuit because he had accepted Elsa back as his wife for a night. So, very cleverly done. She turned around then and divorced him in 1887, and this allowed her to maintain her rights as few as they were as a single woman. She could take her maiden name back, Carrie Kiner, her court costs were covered, and she was allowed to remarry. So, for me, it's not surprising that this Weedsport controversy occurred in this same time period. It must have been a really emotional low point in her life. So as I mentioned, the last performance I found for her was August 1890. Bert Miller, or William H. Roosevelt, died of a heart attack in February 1892 at his sister's home in Utica. Then interestingly enough, Elsa, now Carrie again, after her career ended, married Bert's brother Isaac, who was about 14 years her senior and a widower. And he'd also served in the Civil War, as had William. Carrie and Isaac married in Welland District in Canada on April 19, 1892, and on January 26, 1893, their son Claude was born in Buffalo. 1901 finds them living in Troy, New York, where Isaac was working as the tender of Erie Canal Lock number 8. Then in 1907, the family is back here in Rochester, where Isaac died on October 25th, 1913. And he's buried in the Civil War section of Mount Hope Cemetery, Joanne. Yeah. According to census records of 1915, Carrie was living in the 10th ward. In 1917, she was living at the house Isaac had bought before his death, and she now owned at 114 Lexington Avenue. This house is still standing, and she died there June 2nd, 1935, and she's buried in Riverside Cemetery. And to illustrate how great her reputation was during that decade, when she died in 1935, the New York Times had a half-page obituary about her. So she wasn't just a local phenomenon. She was known throughout the United States. Claude and his wife separated. Claude died, I believe, at 75. And Claude and his wife had one child, Doris. This was Elsa's only, let's say Carrie now, because she's no longer performing, Carrie's only grandchild. And Doris never married or had children. She lovingly kept her grandmother's scrapbooks and trophies until she herself died on May 7th, 2015. And she was 99 years old when she died. And she's buried in Irondequoit Cemetery with her mom and her stepdad. So, what influence did Elsa and her female compatriots have on the way we view and participate in sport today? Outdoor recreation and organized sport rose in popularity following the Civil War. The movement from a farm towards an industrial economy created new opportunities for leisure, even among the working class. Both men and women embraced sports as participants and spectators. And further, editors of the women's suffrage press clearly view women's cycling as not simply depoliticalized recreation, but an important aspect of a multi-issue platform for women's rights. And lastly, the boom in cycling, and that would be the late 1880s, made cyclists of millions of American women. It was their active participation in the craze that had given rise to a new unity that helped to advance the first wave of feminist reform, which included the rational dress movement and increased interest in women's health. Now, as much as women's clothing changed because of the bicycle, there is one item of male attire which was created specifically for bicycle messengers. Can anyone think what it might be?
Knickers?
Athletic supporter. The jockstrap.
That was your second guess.
Yeah. So these are Elsa's own words about what she felt she was accomplishing. In presenting myself to the public in my bicycle exercises, I feel that I'm not only offering the most novel and fascinating entertainment now before the people, but am demonstrating the great need on the part of American young ladies especially of physical culture and bodily exercise. Success in life depends as much upon a vigorous and healthy body as upon a clear and active mind. And also, she took to bicycling about 5 years ago, and her greatest feat was to ride 1,000 miles in 144 hours. This is an extraordinary feat for a woman. It's an extraordinary feat for anyone, especially one who seems as frail as Miss Von Blumen. She says a woman can accomplish anything she undertakes. Arch Merrill, a local history journalist who wrote a column in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle back in the day, interviewed Carrie's daughter-in-law and granddaughter in August of 1961 and reported the following remarks by her relatives. She always resented the inhibitions of the 1880s, which forced her to wear a long skirt while walking and a cumbersome costume with pantaloon-like effect while riding the high bike. She hailed the modern and sensible sports clothes for young people which came into vogue in her old age. The one-time champion hiker deplored the popularity of the automobile because it made people forget how to walk. So it was shocking to me to discover this woman. Here I was a Rochesterian, never heard of her And I thought, how can we be missing this piece of Rochester history? So for me, it's important to get the word out about her and keep her memory alive, because she should be recognized as the sport pioneer that she is. She was really, really a wonder. And those are her gravestones there. The Isaac's is down in the corner, and Caroline's, of course. And every year, Joanne and I and some other women, on the anniversary of her death, we meet at her gravesite, and we just have some wonderful conversations about all sorts of issues in the world. We've planted a flag there in her memory. So if anyone ever likes to do cemetery tours, it's well worth the trip. So thank you very much for coming and listening, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them for you.
Let me take a... If you have a question, I'd like to take the microphone to you. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Oh, come on. No? Okay.
Thank you, very interesting. And you and I will talk about Germany afterwards. I'm a retired German teacher. But where did you find all these sources and resources? There's such an amazing amount of information, and it's such a tough time to find things.
I had read a book. Should I take my Kindle? Good exercise for you.
I had read a book by Sue Macy called The Wheels of Change ages ago. And I saw the name Elsa Von Blumen, Rochester, New York. And I just thought, how can I not know this person? And then COVID came, and I thought, oh, what am I going to do with my time? And fortunately, as a library card holder in the New York Public Library, they allowed you to go into sources, newspapers.com, other sources that usually charge you $15 or $20 a month, and everything was free. And I just started reading every newspaper article I could find. I read all the trade magazines of the time. I found in France, she is much better known than here in her own country. The French website, the Petit Plaquette, which means little gear, has a 30-page history of her. It just boggles my mind. Right now I'm reading through the Union and Advertiser newspapers, which unfortunately don't have an index. So I have to scan every paper, but it's interesting because I see a lot of news of what was happening back at the time. But yeah, her name will turn up. And collaterally, I noticed a lot of other bicycle names. So there was a Nick Kaufman who was very famous, invented sports. He's in the Swiss Museum, was born on Wells Street here. They have monuments to him in the Swiss Museum and nobody knows him. He invented the sports of acrobatic cycling and they call it cycle ball. But it's just very, very interesting how much history gets lost because other things take its place. You know, how much should we bring back? How much do we have to let go? It's just interesting to know what was there. But mostly it was newspapers.
Okay.
I'll walk up this way, Bill, save you some steps.
Thank you.
Okay. I think it's interesting that you mentioned about the volcanic eruption that cooled the world down. I do remember reading once that that following year after the eruption, it was considered the year without a summer. It snowed in Rochester almost every month, including June, which is unusual. But I think it's also quite ironic that she passed away at 114 Lexington Avenue, 1 street south of Driving Park Avenue. very close to where she had that famous exhibition.
Yes.
The last thing I want to say is that I had never heard of her either until sometime in the 1990s when at the Rose Festival, the Bigwood Rose Festival, someone played her in costume. I was a docent for the gorge tours out there, and what a great job that person did. And it really stimulated my interest in what happened at the Driving Park racetrack.
Thank you for those comments. And the person who played her is Pamela Van Hazen.
Really?
Yep, and she's a teacher. Gosh, I've been in touch with her, and I said, Pamela, where did you get this information? How did you know about her? And she said she, was only given the script to play the part, and she tried to contact the person who wrote the script, but she never got through to her. So I'd love to know where that woman got her information. But yeah, Lexington Park. And the only structure remaining from Driving Park,
It's a hotel.
the hotel on Sealy Terrace. The only thing that's left. And I was hoping that I could get the Landmark Society to maybe put up a historical memorial sign there, saying here, Elsa Von Blumen performed here, but as far as I know, it hasn't happened yet, so.
Pomeroy Foundation.
Yeah, well,
Ah.
there's an organization, the Pomeroy, who will grant either a municipality or a nonprofit the money to purchase the sign. You do need exact source documentation, but if you have $1,500, you can put up any sign you want.
I love her, but not that much.
We don't have a program in December, and coming up in January, we'll be back here, and we have a story about an enterprise that has quite a bit of Greece roots. It's going to be the history of Wakeman's. And those, if you don't know, Danny Wakeman grew up in Long Pond, almost across the street from the Wakeman's on Lana, and Bob Wakeman was on the school board. So if you happen to go to Patty Hill School, you know how they always list the school board members? Robert Wakeman is there. So we got a connection to Wakeman's, and their first suburban grocery store was at Northgate. So we're excited to hear about that, and I can't remember what we have in February. So anyway, thank you very much. I hope to see you Sunday. If not, have a great holidays, and hope to see you again next year. Very good. I always say, I hope when you leave here, you can say you learned something. That's always my goal, so I should have it.
I agree with you. That's a good goal.
Upcoming second Tuesdays of the month programs from the Greece Historical Society. Times, dates, and locations for the following programs are subject to change. Please check our Facebook page for updated information. Want to learn more from the Greece Historical Society and Museum? Then click that subscribe button. Hit that bell icon to get notified when there's new content coming from the Greece Historical Society. You can visit us on the web at GreeceHistoricalSociety.org. You can find us on Facebook at Greece Historical Society. And you can stop in at the Greece Historical Society at 595 Long Pond Road.